There's a profound and terrible irony in a man who sells security for a living ending up with none. My entire world was built on the concept of risk management. I could calculate the statistical probability of a house fire in a given zip code, of a flood in a 100-year floodplain, of a car accident at a specific intersection on a rainy Tuesday. I built a career, a business, an entire identity around the promise of a safety net. I sold people peace of mind, a guarantee that if the worst should happen, they would be made whole again. But I never wrote a policy for the disaster that was brewing in my own home, the one that would burn my life to the ground and leave me with nothing but the ashes. It began with the purest of intentions. I was working for a massive, soul-crushing insurance conglomerate. I was a top agent, but I was just a cog in a vast machine. I hated the bureaucracy, the impersonal nature of it all. We weren't helping people. We were processing claims, minimizing payouts, and treating human tragedy as a line item on a spreadsheet. I saw a better way. I dreamed of starting my own independent agency, a company with a conscience, a place where clients were neighbors, not policy numbers, a firm that would be a pillar of the community, built on a foundation of trust and integrity. My wife, she was my first and most ardent believer. In the beginning, her support was the wind in my sails. We'd stay up late at the kitchen table, sketching out business plans on napkins, our excitement a tangible thing in the air between us. We were a team. She was the one who encouraged me to drain our savings, to cash in the small stock portfolio we had, to take out a second mortgage on our modest starter home. It was our big gamble, our shared bet on a brighter future. "It's the ultimate insurance policy for our family," I told her, and I believed it. "We build this, and our kids will be set for life. We'll have a real asset, a legacy." The irony, of course, is that in my quest to build the ultimate safety net, I was systematically dismantling the one we already had. The first couple of years were a brutal, exhilarating grind. I poured every ounce of my being into the company. I was the first one in the office in the morning and the last one to leave at night, long after the city lights had painted streaks across my office window. I was the agent, the underwriter, the marketing department, and the janitor. The sheer volume of work was immense, but I was fueled by a potent cocktail of ambition, passion, and the terrifying knowledge that I had bet everything we had on this venture. My wife was my partner in those early days. She'd bring the kids to the office on weekends, our toddler coloring on the floor while our baby slept in a car seat in the corner. She'd bring me dinner when she knew I'd be working late. She was the keeper of our home life, the steady hand that allowed me to wage my war in the business world. And for a while, it worked. The business grew. My reputation for being an honest, hardworking agent spread through the community. People trusted me. We started to turn a profit, then a bigger one. The feeling was intoxicating. The numbers on the profit and loss statement were a direct validation of my sacrifice, my vision. We started to see the rewards. We paid off the second mortgage. We moved out of our starter home and into a big, beautiful house in a gated community with a swimming pool and a 3-car garage. We took extravagant vacations. I bought my wife expensive jewelry to thank her for her sacrifice, for her belief in me. I thought I was giving her the world. But I didn't realize that the world she wanted was the one we already had, back in that small house at that kitchen table, dreaming together. The bigger the company got, the more I disappeared. The problems became more complex, the stakes higher. It was no longer just about selling policies. It was about managing staff, negotiating with underwriters, handling difficult claims. The stress was immense, a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that never quite went away. The business was a voracious beast that demanded my constant attention, and I fed it willingly. I fed it my time, my energy, my peace of mind, and I started to feed it my family. I'd be at the dinner table, physically present, but my mind would be a million miles away, replaying a difficult conversation with a client, worrying about a new competitor, strategizing my next move. My son would be telling me about his day, and I'd nod and smile, but I wasn't really listening. My wife would try to talk to me about something, and my eyes would drift to the blinking light of my BlackBerry on the counter. The device was a leash, tying me to the office, to the beast. I started to see my family as a distraction from the important work I was doing. Their needs, their small daily dramas, felt trivial compared to the high-stakes world I inhabited. The business wasn't just a job anymore. It had become my entire identity. The man who had started out wanting to build a better life for his family was now sacrificing his family for the sake of his business. My wife started to complain. Her gentle suggestions became frustrated pleas. "Can you please just be here?" she'd ask. "The kids miss their dad. We never talk anymore." I would get defensive, angry. I saw her pleas not as a cry for connection, but as a criticism of my work ethic, a lack of appreciation for the sacrifices I was making. "I'm doing this for us," I'd shout, the words that had once been our mantra now a weapon I used to shut her down. "This house, this car, the kids' private school, it doesn't just appear out of thin air. It takes work. It takes sacrifice." I truly believed it. I believed the material things were an adequate substitute for my presence, for my love. I was a man who understood the fine print of a 100-page insurance contract, but I couldn't read the simple, desperate language in my own wife's eyes. I was building a fortress of financial security around my family, but inside the walls, the inhabitants were starving for the one thing I was no longer providing: me. The man who sold protection from every conceivable disaster was becoming the primary disaster in his own home, and the worst part is I was completely, utterly blind to it. The turning point, the moment the hairline cracks in my empire began to widen into chasms, wasn't a single, dramatic event. It was a slow, creeping rot from within. The insurance market, like any other, is cyclical. After a few years of steady growth and favorable conditions, a hard market began to set in. Underwriters became more cautious, premiums started to rise, and competition became cutthroat. The big national companies I had once railed against could afford to absorb the changing conditions. They could operate at a loss in one area to squeeze out smaller players like me. My agency, which had seemed so robust, was suddenly fragile. The pressure to maintain the growth, to keep the profits climbing, was immense. My lifestyle, our lifestyle, was now dependent on it. The mortgage on the big house, the car payments, the country club membership, they were all predicated on the assumption that the business would only ever go up. I started to make decisions not from a place of prudence and integrity, but from a place of fear. Fear of failure, fear of losing the life I had built, fear of being seen as anything less than the brilliant success everyone thought I was. My principles, the very foundation upon which I'd built the company, started to erode. I began to push my agents to sell more expensive, complex policies that clients didn't necessarily need. I started to dabble in riskier commercial lines, chasing bigger premiums without having the proper expertise or reserves to back them up. The concept of risk management, once my guiding star, was now something I actively worked to circumvent. I was gambling, using my client's security and my company's stability as my poker chips. The stress manifested in my body. I stopped sleeping through the night, waking up at 3 a.m. with my heart pounding, my mind a whirlwind of worst-case scenarios. I developed a nervous tic, a constant clenching of my jaw that made my teeth ache. I was irritable, on edge, a walking bundle of raw nerves. My home was no longer a sanctuary, it was just another place where I felt like I was failing. The distance between my wife and me became a vast, silent ocean. We stopped fighting. The arguments were replaced by a cold, polite distance that was far more terrifying. We were roommates, coexisting in a beautiful house that felt more like a museum than a home. The laughter was gone. The easy intimacy we once shared was a distant memory. I started to lie to her. It began with small omissions. I wouldn't tell her about a major client we'd lost or a new competitor that had opened up down the street. I was trying to protect her from the stress, but in reality, I was protecting my own fragile ego. I couldn't bear the thought of her seeing me as weak, as someone who was losing control. The small omissions grew into outright deception. I started to cook the books just a little at first. I'd move numbers around on the quarterly reports I showed her, inflating our profits, hiding our losses. I created a fictional reality for her, a carefully constructed illusion of success that bore little resemblance to the precarious truth. I, the man who sold policies based on the principle of utmost good faith, was acting in the worst faith imaginable toward the person I was supposed to love and trust the most. The wall of lies I was building between us was becoming impenetrable. She knew something was wrong. She wasn't stupid. She could feel the tension in the house, see the growing panic in my eyes. But she couldn't get through to me. I had locked her out and I had thrown away the key. My relationship with my children became a series of transactions. I didn't have time for a game of catch or to read a bedtime story, but I could buy them the latest video game or the most expensive sneakers. I was substituting presents for presents, trying to pay off my guilt with my checkbook. I remember my son's 8th birthday. I had promised him I'd be there for his party. It was a Saturday. But a crisis erupted at the office, a major claim from one of the risky commercial clients I had taken on. I spent the entire day on the phone with lawyers and adjusters. I missed the whole party. I came home late that evening to find a single piece of birthday cake waiting for me on the kitchen counter, a note from my wife beside it. He waited for you to cut the cake. He eventually blew out the candles by himself. The words were simple, factual, and they were the most damning indictment of my fatherhood I had ever read. I stood there in the silent kitchen, the weight of my failure pressing down on me, and I felt nothing but a hollow, aching emptiness. I was losing them. I was losing it all. But I was so deep in the hole, so trapped in the web of my own lies and ambition that I didn't know how to stop digging. The company was my identity. If it went down, I would go down with it. The idea of letting go, of admitting defeat, was unthinkable. It would mean confessing to my wife that our entire life was a sham, that the security I had promised them was a house of cards, so I kept pushing. I took out a high-interest business loan, a desperate infusion of cash to cover our mounting losses. I told my wife it was for expansion. Another lie, another brick in the wall. The debt was suffocating me, the interest payments a constant drain on our already hemorrhaging finances. I was no longer the captain of my own ship. I was a slave in the galley, rowing frantically to keep a sinking vessel afloat, heading directly into the heart of a storm of my own creation. And the sky was getting darker by the minute. The end came swiftly and without mercy. The catalyst was a single, catastrophic event, the kind of outlier event that I, as an insurance man, should have been prepared for. A freak hailstorm, the worst in a century, tore through our region. It was a biblical event, with ice the size of golf balls shattering windows, denting cars, and shredding roofs. In the space of 20 minutes, my company, which was heavily concentrated with local homeowner and auto policies, was effectively rendered insolvent. The number of claims was overwhelming, a tidal wave that swamped our small operation. My agents' phones rang off the hook. My office was flooded with frantic, desperate clients. These were the neighbors I had promised to protect, the people who had put their trust in me, and I had no way to help them. The problem was, in my desperate chase for profits, I had been under-reserving. I hadn't set aside enough capital to cover a large-scale disaster. My risk management models were based on optimistic, best-case scenarios, not the brutal reality of a worst-case event. Furthermore, the risky commercial policies I had written came back to haunt me. Several large businesses were hit and their claims were astronomical, far exceeding the premiums they had paid. I had gambled and the house had won. The days that followed were the most hellish of my life. I was living in a state of pure, undiluted panic. I was on the phone constantly with my underwriters, my reinsurers, the state insurance commissioner. The conversations were a blur of cold, hard numbers and colder, harder truths. I was undercapitalized. I was overexposed. I was, in the blunt, unforgiving language of the industry, screwed. I tried to hide the severity of the situation from my wife, but it was impossible. The disaster was the only thing on the local news. She saw the lines of people outside my office. She heard the desperation in my voice when I came home for a few hours of sleepless rest. She knew. The lie was over. My desperate final act was to try and save the company with our own money. I drained every last cent from our personal accounts, our investment accounts, even the college savings funds I had set up for the children. I threw it all into the black hole of the business, a frantic, irrational attempt to plug a hole in a dam with my bare hands. It was a futile gesture, the financial equivalent of a death rattle. The day the state insurance commissioner's office officially declared my company insolvent and took it into receivership is a blur. I remember men in suits walking into my office, and telling me I no longer had any authority. They changed the locks. They boxed up my personal belongings. I was escorted out of the building I had built, a pariah in my own creation. I walked out into the parking lot, clutching a cardboard box with a framed family photo and a stupid coffee mug, and I just stood there, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun, a man with no job, no company, and a debt so massive it felt like a physical object. The drive home was a drive toward my own execution. I had to tell her. I had to confess everything. The lies, the cooked books, the siphoning of our personal funds, the utter and complete totality of our ruin. I walked into the house, our big, beautiful house that I now knew we would lose. She was sitting at the kitchen island, a place we had once dreamed of, now the setting for the end of our world. She looked at me, and in her eyes there was no surprise, just a deep, weary, and bottomless sadness. I told her everything. The words tumbled out of me, a torrent of shame and regret. I didn't make excuses. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I just laid the ugly, brutal truth out on the table between us. I told her we had lost everything. The house, the cars, the savings, the college funds, everything. I had burned it all to the ground. When I was finished, the silence in the room was absolute. It was heavier than any sound I had ever heard. I waited for her to scream, to cry, to throw something at me. I deserved all of that and more. But she did none of those things. She just looked at me, her gaze steady, and she spoke two sentences that have haunted me ever since. "The money doesn't matter," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "You were gone a long time ago. This just makes it official." And with that, she stood up, walked past me, and went upstairs to pack a bag. It wasn't the loss of the money that had broken us. It was the loss of trust. It was the years of my absence, my emotional abandonment. The bankruptcy was not the cause of our divorce. It was merely the final symptom of a disease that had been rotting our marriage from the inside out for years. She left that evening with the children. I remember my son looking at me from the back seat of the car, his expression not of anger but of confusion, of a child who doesn't understand the adult world that has just collapsed around him. My daughter wouldn't even look at me. As I watched their taillights disappear down the long, tree-lined driveway of the house we no longer owned, I finally understood the true meaning of insolvency. It wasn't just a financial state. It was a moral one. A spiritual one. I was bankrupt in every sense of the word. I had nothing left. I stood alone in that big, empty house, the silence roaring in my ears, a man who had sold security and ended up the sole victim of his own catastrophic, uninsurable risk. The days that followed her departure were a waking nightmare. The big, empty house became my tomb. The silence that had once been a rare commodity was now my constant, suffocating companion. Every room was a museum of my failure, filled with the ghosts of a life I had systematically destroyed. I'd walk past my children's bedrooms, the beds still unmade, a stuffed animal lying on the floor, and the grief would be so overwhelming it would bring me to my knees. The legal and financial fallout was a brutal, protracted agony. Bankruptcy court, creditors' meetings, depositions. I was a leper, a pariah in the local business community. The same people who had once clapped me on the back at Chamber of Commerce meetings now crossed the street to avoid me. The shame was a physical cloak I couldn't take off. My wife communicated with me only through her lawyer. The words were cold, clinical, legal. Dissolution of marriage. Division of assets. Except there were no assets to divide. There was only debt, a mountain of it that would be my burden to carry alone. The house was sold at a loss. The cars were repossessed. Every trapping of our successful life was stripped away, one humiliating piece at a time. I moved into a small, bleak apartment across town with furniture I bought from a thrift store. My new view was not of a manicured lawn and a swimming pool, but of a dumpster and a brick wall. It was a fitting reflection of my new station in life. I hit a bottom so deep I didn't think I would ever find my way back. For weeks, I barely left the apartment. I didn't answer the phone. I didn't see anyone. I was consumed by a toxic cocktail of self-pity, shame, and a rage so profound it scared me. I raged at the economy, at my competitors, at the hailstorm, at God. But in my rare moments of brutal honesty, I knew the truth. The only person to blame was the man in the mirror. My wife allowed me to see the kids every other weekend. The first few visits were excruciating. I'd pick them up in my beat-up, 10-year-old car, and we'd go to a park or a cheap movie because that's all I could afford. The easy, natural affection we once shared was gone, replaced by an awkward, painful formality. They were hurt and confused. They didn't understand what had happened, only that their father, who had once been a giant in their world, was now a diminished, sad man living in a small, sad apartment. Restoring their trust, I knew, would be the work of a lifetime. I had to find a job. My name was toxic in the insurance industry, in any white-collar profession, really. The story of my company's collapse was local legend. After countless rejections, I took a job that required no resume, no references, and no dignity. I became a dispatcher for a local plumbing company, working the night shift. I would sit in a small, windowless office from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., answering calls from people with overflowing toilets and burst pipes. I would listen to their panicked voices and calmly send a plumber to their rescue. The irony was not lost on me. I, the man who had failed to manage a catastrophe of his own making, was now the calm, reassuring voice for people in the midst of their own small, domestic disasters. The work was humbling, but it was also strangely therapeutic. It was simple. It was honest. And it gave me something I desperately needed, a sense of purpose, however small. It also gave me time to think. In the long, quiet hours of the night, With only the hum of the radio for company, I began to unpack the wreckage of my life. I finally confronted the ugly truth about my ambition, my ego, my catastrophic confusion of net worth with self-worth. I had chased a version of success that had nothing to do with happiness or fulfillment. I had wanted to build a legacy, but a legacy is not a building or a balance sheet. A legacy is the love you leave behind in the hearts of your children, the integrity with which you live your life. By that measure, I had been heading for bankruptcy long before the hailstorm ever hit. Slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild, not a business, but a man. I started with my children. I stopped trying to impress them or buy their affection. I just focused on being present. I would listen, really listen to their stories. I would help my son with his math homework over the phone. I would draw silly pictures and mail them to my daughter. They were small gestures, but they were consistent. They were real. The awkwardness began to fade, replaced by a new, tentative connection. It wasn't the same as it was before, and I knew it never would be. The scars were too deep, but it was something. It was a start. I never reconciled with my ex-wife. The trust was too broken, the damage too severe. But the anger between us eventually softened into a kind of weary peace, a shared commitment to co-parenting our children as best we could. I came to respect her for her strength, for her resilience, for her unwavering focus on what was best for our kids. She was and always had been a better person than me. I still work the night shift at the plumbing company. I live a quiet, simple life. The mountain of debt is still there, and I make a small payment on it every month. I know I will likely be paying it for the rest of my life. It's my penance, a constant reminder of the man I used to be. I am no longer a man who sells security. I have learned the hard way that there is no such thing. Life is inherently risky. The only real insurance, the only true safety net, is the strength of your character and the love of your family. I lost mine in a storm of my own making. My hope now is not to rebuild an empire or to reclaim some lost glory. My hope is much smaller, much quieter, and infinitely more important. It is to be a good father. It is to be a man my children can one day respect, not for what he built, but for how he learned to live after it all came crashing down. I'd love to know what this made you feel or remember. Have you ever had something like this happen in your life? Drop your experience in the comments below. Let's create a conversation that others can connect to.